Fantasy was my first addiction. I escaped the horrors of being raised at home in an abusive, alcoholic home riddled with mental health issues from the impact of generational trauma and suffering from food poverty and food insecurity. As a child and through parts of my adolescence, I struggled in sharing the extent of what I endured externally because of the few tenets were don't ask, don't talk, don't question, don't trust, and don't feel. I convinced myself that I was Sisyphus. I was carrying the self-imposed boulder. As a child, it was a boulder to protect my family's secrets. And as an adult, it became a symbol of being a self-proclaimed curse breaker as I take on the weight of my context and of my story and my predecessors before me while navigating life. I am descended from an extensive line of addiction, insanity, and violence. I don't need to let the gravity of their story and mine pull me down, but I did until I imploded. I often glorified death as a sweet escape and as a respite from the chaos that reached internally and externally. As the years passed, my fantasy of that sweet death transformed into chasing the high of la petite mort, which I now understand to be the foundation of my sex, love, and fantasy addiction and anorexia. When I was little, what often brought me comfort in the darkest times was fantasy. I loved to pray, count, be in nature, read, and listen to music. Obsessively trying to count to infinity while hiding in cabinets and under tables to steer clear of attracting attention, or on the stairs to keep watch out at night when I felt brave enough to protect my family. Infinity felt like the most tangible way I can conceptualize higher power in those moments when words escaped me to pray for comfort. I felt safe being small. I counted reps of exercises as my first qualifier's favorite form of discipline. These moments of exercise could last minutes or sometimes hours. Counting helped distract me. Anything less than perfect would add additional punishment and time. I counted when things were peaceful and calm. I hold loving memories of laying across the grass and on top of silt banks, soaking up the sun, feeling the earth's rotations, and counting as high as I can and everything I see on my landlocked black beach. The numbers of ingredients while attempting to make my own food, keeping track of grocery bills in the store, reciting house numbers and telephone numbers. Reading was a joy because I could escape to any place, anytime, anywhere, and perhaps all at once. What mattered is that reality dissolved, and I can feel the characters and not myself. Reading was also joy because it was one of the few activities that was shared with a parental figure. The other was music. As a child, music was my primary means to feel my feelings, as well as to connect with my family. This carried on through adolescence. I often found music to be cathartic and the only area that I would grant myself permission to feel. I built a community in music circles by attending and organizing punk shows in my adolescence. And I connected with others by sharing music as an adult, including luring in my liaisons. My early childhood was a roller coaster of highs and lows that I needed to learn to navigate through in order to survive the abuse of being perpetuated in the home by my alcoholic father. Fantasy was the only way I found safety, care, and comfort. Fantasy kept me safe from feeling the pain of physical abuse that I was subjected to. Fantasy blocked memories of sexual abuse that I endured by my family. Fantasy helped me support my mother while she was a victim of my father's rage. Fantasy protected my mother from murder attempts. My fantasy also protected my sister from witnessing directly all that I saw while I internalized the experience so no one outside from our family unit knew what was happening. If it wasn't for the unpredictable, chaotic energy from my addict qualifier, I was navigating the impact of my loving enabler mother's reactivity and dissociation that was intensified by her own mental health issues and trauma. Like my loving addict, my loving enabler wasn't there emotionally and at times mentally. For example, she let her judgment fog her as she powered washed me at 4 years old at a car wash so we didn't have to turn around and go home to clean the vomit off of me from being car sick. We can laugh about it, but we don't talk about how it can be considered harmful. She escaped her life with her own addictions and overfunctioning to persevere. She did her best, but she really lacked the tender, loving care that I learned to expect and attach to what a mother should look like through acts that never occurred over and over again and now well into adulthood. She and I had a tumultuous relationship because I did not realize I was reenacting the same behaviors as my father when she confronted me as a teenager as a means to protect myself. This further exasperated things between her and I, to the point that I would be physically reprimanded for the overreactionary response to her. Hers were more unpredictable and could be out of nowhere. This is when I shifted from having my power taken to giving my power freely over. In my first 12-step program 17 years ago, I learned to identify these patterns, but with S.L.A.A., I was gifted the tools to fully articulate the impact, my role, and how I've harmed others in my addiction, and begin to disarm. When I work my steps, I can see how I've clung to my resentments in order to feed them until they manifested into deep shame and guilt narratives. I'm learning to accept that I choose comfort in those dark fantasies as a child and then well into adulthood. I never truly allowed myself to feel, to be seen, to be heard, or to be loved because of my stinking thinking drove me further into insanity. Change felt impossible with all the secrets I kept hidden away. S.L.A.A. has saved my life in a multitude of ways because it empowers me to live in the light. Surprisingly enough, my suicide attempt wasn't my bottom that led me to S.L.A.A. It was my acting out behaviors and sex and love addiction that did. After my suicide in April of 2024, I went into a 30-day mental health rehabilitation center for women. After the event, I left with a head full of hope and denial. I started to reacclimate back to regular life while also enrolled into a PHP program. I went back to work as a corporate professional, attended my fellow 12-step recovery programs, tended to my family and my pets. Slowly, I slipped into codependent and addictive relationships with my family, and at the time, my recent ex-fiance. I found myself rescuing and giving more than what is manageable. I didn't want to admit that I was still in my disease, and my disease was activated. To ignore reality, I turned to fantasy life. I set up one dating app and then the other, quickly turning fantasies into reality. Having first a toxic and enmeshed sexually addicted relationship in which we pretended to play house together. This turned into quickly scheduling dates after another. Any free time I had outside of my family, I made sure I had plans. I thought I deserved an escape. I deserved to connect with others. Underneath it, I was truly looking for entertainment, novelty, and a false sense of intimacy through objectification of others in order to self-soothe myself. Within 6 months, I went from one dating app to turning my dating roster into a client list of sorts, freely sending personal adult content. And then when those connections got stale and I was no longer interested, charging for content because I didn't want to let them go like my resentments. Dates became events and events became parties. Dating singles became exhaustive because they craved exclusivity while all I wanted freedom. Dating couples offered me space, but I still made myself small. Vanilla wasn't enough, and nor was BDSM play. Over time, I couldn't outrun myself or my disease. My addiction was no longer fun, and I wasn't getting high from turning my life into an adventure book in order to escape reality. My addiction hijacked the train. I acted out until I started to act in. I lost all feeling, literally suffering from broken bones, from my high-risk behaviors in sex addiction, and metaphorically as I further dissociated and deepened my love anorexia. Finding S.L.A.A. saved my life just from the very action of stopping my acting out behaviors. As I deepened my recovery and my connection to program and stopped my acting out, my thoughts were surfacing. My dark fantasies were emerging as I started to reflect on where my path had taken me. Shame and guilt began to bubble up again, and I felt myself descending because how I've hurt and used and manipulated others. I started to withdraw internally, realizing how I exploded in sex addiction while the other spheres of my life were also suffering. My life was split into two, both becoming increasingly unmanageable. Luckily, in September of 2024, I stumbled across a friend of S.L.A.A. They introduced me to the program as they witnessed and experienced my unmanageability of my internal and external worlds and my addiction. Withdrawal was difficult. My first few bottom lines were easy to define, but as the layers began to unfold, I discovered other ways in which I acted out and in order to add to the list. The more I withdrew from sex and love, the more fantasy became exposed. I felt like a never-ending battle with a hydra. When one head was slain, three more sprouted in its place. As I became sober from my acting out behaviors and bottom lines, I began to see myself through the reflections I was projecting onto others. These projections and these reflections were a manifestation of my shame and guilt. I understand shame to be defined as the feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of a wrong or foolish behavior. For me, shame is a multi-layered emotion. I do believe that there are instances in which shame can be a positive motivator, but for me, my relationship is toxic. I consider this a trait of my negative validation seeking. If I did something bad or someone said something bad about me, I habituated myself into internalizing and identifying with this negativity to springboard growth without acknowledging the deeper roots and seeing the lesson in defining my own limits and boundaries. My shame track is my internalized fear, my fear of exposure, my fear of judgments, my fear of safety, and my insecurities. This deepens negative thoughts surrounding not feeling lovable or being lovable, identifying with being inherently broken and unworthy. This is the core of my fundamental belief that I am flawed and defective. I exasperate this sensation and this feeling with the layers of guilt I pile on to conceal that the shame even exists. This is the entry point in which my shame begins. I did something wrong, and I deserve the negative outcomes. When I'm in a state of guilt, I am not right-sizing accountability, grace, or compassion for just being human. My shame seeks out connection, but yet fears it. As I work the steps, I find myself realizing that in addiction, I act out when I experience characteristic 6. Tools like the fantasy 3x3x3 allow me to connect with my fantasy safely. For me, fantasy is not isolated to intrigue, sexualized fantasies, etc. It is the addictive thoughts that perpetuate my addiction. The 3x3x3 began to offer greater clarity into my fantasies. I saw my fear, my shame, and my guilt most of all. I learned to name my shame as these things came up more frequently in my 3x3x3s. I have 3 names, actually, of the shame that I have in my internal talk track. Naming these shame narratives help me separate the thought from reality in order to be gentle with myself as I get to the core. If you don't mind, I'd like to share the names of my shame with you. The first one is Arlie Ermey, the actor that played the drill sergeant in Full Metal Jacket that my dad deeply aspired to be like. I took on that narrative as my own. He is my ragey perfectionist, the one that turns my moments of shame from motivation into chronic self-flagellation. The second shame narrative that I identified is my Schadenfreude, like Schadenfreude. My shame, like misery, enjoys company. I can weaponize my internal thoughts to travel deeper into negative thought loops, amassing a large collection in the process to fuel my negativity. And finally, Fletcher, my shame persona that meets the world like in Whiplash. It's avoidant and sarcastic while using other people's projections against them as motivation despite having the best intentions. Arlie Ermy kept me safe as a child. I use the external reality to find ways and means of coping with stress internally. I cleaved on to narratives that I heard explicitly that I was never wanted and that I was never enough and that I don't have value. And implicit acts to fuel that I'm not deserving and not worthy. Being small felt safe, and Arlie Ermy helped keep me small. My shame helped me find it. I use these perfectionistic standards as motivations to keep reading, learning, and growing. I use shame as motivator for development, so I may never end up like how I started. My shame taught me a false sense of freedom. When I began to feel like I did something bad and I was deserving of punishment and pain, no moment was safe. I was in a constant state of hyper-awareness, in scrutinizing myself to find harms in order to self-flagellate so I can expand. This became my normal state, a state of Schadenfreude as I became an adult. And when I feel like I'm acting out of a place of resentment for my own codependent behaviors, I express myself as Fletcher, keeping everyone at bay while rationalizing how cold and detached I am to motivate those that were harmed by my rescuing. Gaining the awareness of my thoughts has been a true blessing of working the steps in S.L.A.A. The miracle of keeping the shame at bay happens when I engage in top lines. Top lines for fantasy were difficult for me to start at first, but as I leaned into the tools of recovery in order to give my fantasies productivity. One, step work. Step work is huge and a large key for me to be grounded and balanced in reality. Step 4, inventories, as well as the 3x3x3, helps keep things right-sized and honest in myself. Step 9, in offering an amends to myself, encourages me to be gentle and to practice the principles, traditions, and concepts of program in order to be honest with others in reality on a daily basis. Outreach helps me gain wisdom from friends and fellows when I'm trapped in the glass case of emotions and my own ego. They offer me safe reflections to break that mask and that shame that and the mask that my shame hides behind. Prayer, when I'm noticing these thoughts, helps redirect my thoughts towards God. I turn them over for strength, wisdom, and guidance. Meditation offers me peace and serenity. For me, meditation can happen in a variety of ways. It can be in meetings and listening to others, or enjoying nature. Any moment that I can intentionally carve out a gentle space to sit with myself and in my body without judgment is key. And finally, action. Idle hands are a devil's plaything. I find myself slipping into shame narratives when I'm not joyfully participating in life. Without the tools of the program, my shame leads me to focus on the whole of the donut. If I'm in a negative place and I'm not right-sizing my emotions and thoughts, my shame convinces me that I need to carve away more. It tells me that I'm not quite at tempo. I scrutinize and I fixate until I'm the whole of the donut and collapsing into the black hole of myself. I call this the everything bagel phenomenon. The acceptance is key, and working the steps, the 5 S's, has been crucial in overriding the shame that comes up that drove me into states of hiding, dismissing, and avoiding and acting out behavior. Inspired action is how I live in the solution and stay committed to God and to program. I still have avoidant tendencies, but the same shame cues still pop up and the mask slides on, but today I can trust that with time, space, and a dedicated program, that these moments can be informational. And I can use that in order to go upwards in the spiral instead of downwards. Thank you for letting me share.
Oh my goodness, that was inspiring. And thank you for your vulnerability. I think it's really hard to speak to a sea of our profile pictures. Obviously, we asked people to be off camera because of the recording, but you couldn't see the affirmation in the room and how our hearts were moved and how we were nodding along. And you couldn't see the points of resonance. But I hope you're appreciating the emojis flying across the screen. Thank you so much for your share. So there's opportunity now to ask some questions, and they can come through the chair. If you want to pop those in the chat to everyone, that'd be awesome.
So the 3x3x3 inventory is a special inventory that was written by the now Fantasy Conference Committee. I believe I have that correctly. Please do let me know if that is incorrect. But the 3x3x3 is an inventory, and what it has, I'm pulling up a copy, but it has the person that's reflecting think about their fantasy. It could be an object of fantasy or a ruminating thought. And in the document, it says, I am obsessed with blank. And I think blank. And it offers a few prompts in order to dig in and underneath, identify projected wants, fears, and hates, and then coaches and instructs additional questions to get underneath the fantasy in order to discern what is my part versus what is someone else's part. This is available through emailing the fantasy intergroup, and I will list the email in the chat for you to request a copy. It truly is a wonderful document that has helped support my recovery.
I was just going to say, how did you start working your program?
Like a good addict, I entered program in an addictive relationship. I found S.L.A.A. through a qualifier who's also in program, and that I'm really grateful for because I have time in recovery and other fellowships, but did not see my own mask in the way in which I showed up in sex and love addiction. But truly grateful because if I didn't stumble across this person, I don't think I would have been able to have the grace or compassion in order to navigate the neck injury that I sustained while in addiction.
People were struck by the way you were able to name the parts of your shame and actually give them names. How did you identify them? Did that take a long time, or did that all come together quite quickly?
It takes a long time. So I understand, can't remember if our beginning slides say do not reference outside healing modalities. But for me, what helped me begin to name these narratives and parts is participating in IFS parts work. My IFS parts work helps me in another 12-step fellowship. I had an understanding of what these cues are from doing the steps in these other programs. But in S.L.A.A., in leaning into my fantasy, for example, I love movies and I love books. When I would have these really big emotions, these really big feelings that would take over my internalized thoughts, I would sit with myself and think, where is this coming from? Who does this sound like? Using the 3x3 inventory, I was able to dig in and underneath and be able to see signs and symbols that spoke to me. And that really inspired the names. Naming the shame and the different kinds of shame internalized talk tracks helps me now separate when that does come up inside of me and be able to offer grace and compassion.
Thank you. You mentioned the suicidal thoughts. So since coming into S.L.A.A, have those been an issue for you, or idealization? Has that entered your mind post S.L.A.A?
I've not had any active suicidal thoughts or ideation since entering the program. I did have a moment in which I was triggered into acting out self-harm like behaviors without the suicidal intent. So I do define a clear delineation because sometimes my obsessive compulsive habits and behaviors drive me into other things. But when that comes up, I'm able to name it, identify it, and collect awareness on it. Every day gets a little easier and a little better. But what really helps me in navigating my suicidal thoughts and ideation is working program. I work this fellowship. I also participate in 3 other fellowships. I do therapy and also have medication management.
Do any of your bottom lines relate specifically to fantasy?
Yes, I do have bottom lines that speak directly to fantasy. For example, I have different types of music that I have bottom line as it triggers addictive thoughts and obsessive thoughts about specific qualifiers. I have bottom line surrounding my participation and engagement with, for example, tarot reading and astrology. So for me, what is bottom line is not pulling tarot cards or paying for tarot readings on other people. Same with astrology. It is only a self-focused practice. I also have, instead of limiting myself to things like the 3-second rule, when rumination pops up, I turn it into a top line. So when I begin to ruminate or have moments of hyperfixation, I turn to the tools of recovery. So for example, when I notice that I'm ruminating or hyperfixating on a topic, I immediately start writing a step 4 inventory, knowing that the tool offers me relief. And then I turn it over to my sponsor as well as trusted fellows. If the step 4 inventory doesn't work, I dig in a little deeper with the 3x3x3. I make outreach calls and I just continue to integrate the steps in order to get relief from the fantasy that's coming up.
I mean, some of us, as we begin our journey in S.L.A.A, we begin to add stuff to our beginning speech when we say, I'm Martin, I'm a sex and love addict, I am a sexually emotional anorexic, I'm a P&M addict, I'm a fantasy addict. So at what point did you start realizing that fantasy was a real issue in terms of your sex and love addiction? And does that tie in with your anorexia at all? Did you work the anorexia steps? Sometimes fantasy is also projection. And people are really appreciative of such an incredible and courageous share.
It took me about 3 or 4 months in program and dabbling in S.L.A.A for me to begin identifying fantasy as a really big primary driver of my addiction. It was easy for me because my bottom lines are very explicit. They speak directly to my experience in the BDSM lifestyle, community, and in play. Through S.L.A.A virtual intergroup, I found a special interest group that's called the BDSM Special Interest Group. And it's a collection of individuals that know that their addiction was carried into BDSM play and lifestyle. And immediately when I started working the steps adjacent to the BDSM group and giving service, it was so very apparent. My behaviors were the fantasies that I turned into reality, that I pushed into higher risk and more dangerous spheres, and directly impacted me. After I stayed off of those physical bottom lines, it was easier to shift in seeing how the signs and symbols in how I expressed myself physically and in reality also map to my internal world. That wouldn't have been possible without the steps, fellowship, as well as sponsors.
So, folk are interested. Very briefly, you touched on other programs. Are you able to just tell us what they are, particularly due to ACA stuff? Just briefly touch on those.
Yes. So, first fellowship is Al-Anon. I have 17 years in Al-Anon. ACA was my second fellowship with 7 years, and Codependence Anonymous is the third fellowship that I have outside of S.L.A.A. I have 3 years there, and I just added AA into my recovery program for in-person fellowship and meetings, since there are no in-person S.L.A.A. meetings in my immediate geography.
Thank you. So thinking about social situations as they come up, how do you deal with those? Do you consciously take a moment to step away? Do you write a step for infantry really quickly? Maybe even it's in your head.
Finding the balance is hard. This is still an area of opportunity for me. I find myself very impulsively responding to people, but with practicing the tools, it gets better and a little easier. And that does intentionally starts with pausing. Pausing when I receive a text message, or I'm talking to someone on the phone or chatting with someone in person. In person, it's way harder because I can't truly take a moment to step away and come back. But at least through digital communication, I can intentionally create that space to pause, to check, how is this making me feel? How does my body feel? And if I feel like I'm triggered or activated, I know that now isn't the appropriate time to respond. I pause. Sometimes I work a step 4, sometimes I do a 10. It all depends on what is coming up for me. And then when I work those items in consultation, I use that as my cue to reach out. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I still slip on no contact from time to time. I get excited and I don't realize that my excitement, I'm also slipping into fawning or other ways of masking. So it truly is a practice and a lifelong journey.
Thank you, Megan. All the stuff you mentioned, that's an awful lot of recovery going on. So maybe you're a mum as well, maybe you've got a job as well, you're doing incredible service at intergroup level, you have sponsees. I mean, how do you balance all that recovery and avoid burnout?
This keeps me so sober in so many ways. Service helps me where, gosh, servicing was key in me staying off my bottom lines in the beginning. Having experience in other recovery programs, I knew that service is going to be a really big, helpful tool for me. And that quickly became the center of how I structure my program here in S.L.A.A. When I right size program and service and my involvement in these other recovery programs, it does require me to be more disciplined in my time. And that's a wonderful joy and a byproduct of program. S.L.A.A. offers me a really solid framework that I can use and integrate into my everyday life to say, am I in balance with myself? Am I over giving or over contributing? What is in alignment to my skills and my values? What can I let go of? What can I do more of? But treating and being mindful of these items is a top line. So finding joy in the process is key in order to hedge the risk of burnout.
So there was a little girl there who needed to find a strategy for keeping herself safe and surviving some pretty traumatic circumstances. And you said you found comfort in dark fantasies. Are you able to say a little bit more about what those dark fantasies mean for you? And how are those needs now met in perhaps more healthy ways in your recovery?
Thank you for the question. Love this. So for me, dark fantasy helps me identify my blueprint and my strategy for life. If it's my self-will run riot, my blueprint for reality and my life strategy is to be alone, suffering, and dead. I quickly overextend and overgive with resentment and beholden of outcome, to the point that I'm depleted, not really offering a true mindful or aware experience. When I dig into this process, I can see that the dark fantasies, one is that suicidal track about how people enter and exit my life, as well as the way I treat people. It can prompt the ideation. And then dark fantasy as well is where I also see my shame, my guilt, my fear, my other forms of resentment. Those help me to stay isolated. So if my life strategy is to stay isolated, alone, and suffering or dead, for me to get those needs met in recovery, that truly is embodying a life of top lines and being a joyful participant and welcoming in happiness just in everyday life activities. Top lines in the beginning started off as making my bed, putting on socks, but over time that grew to just being mindful in everyday world.
Awesome, thank you. And just one final question. You've shared with us aspects of your sexuality. Have you a vision for what your sexuality might look like, free from obsession, free from compulsion, free from addiction? Are you able to embrace it, or is it something you've had to totally leave behind, never to return?
Love this question. So for me, my vision is included in my dating plan. So I am still abstinent. I am still celibate. I started the process of sober dating, but when I think about the sober dating experience and forging sober, healthy connections with others, I do need to be able to articulate my needs. I have to articulate my addictive behaviors and find what is true and honest and genuine, in getting and working the steps through the idea of BDSM. This helps me define what is and is not addictive behaviors for me. I was able to identify what are patterns and behaviors that truly were addictive in nature, that I was doing for validation seeking, or that I was participating in order to get affirmation. Those are still truly bottom line. I have a list of what I consider sober sexual behaviors for me included in my dating plan to um, like weaved in. So dating plans look different for each person. For me, I do have a timetable dating plan in which I identify at what point in time in the relationship or in the connection does it make sense to introduce this. Will it be healthy for me, or is this something that needs time?
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone who asked the question, and thank you for some really insightful answers as we apply your share and your answers to our own recovery. Thank you.